In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Let's be seated. Last week we had a parable, right? This is where we get to review, right? Right? If you weren't here last week, we're going to catch you up. What was the parable last week for those of you who were here? Boy, 7 days. That's all it takes, right? We had a persistent widow and an unjust judge. And last week, I kind of tore into that parable a little bit because Luke said it was about prayer. It can also be read about other things. I also pointed out that there was a red thread running through this that we don't pick up in English because translators, how many of you were learning about synonyms in, like, I don't know, 4th grade, and you wrote a paper and you used the same word over and over and the teacher circled it and said, find a synonym? Yeah, we like variety in English. The Greeks didn't do that because they didn't have bolding, underlining, and italics to draw attention to something, so they just repeated it over and over. Same is true in Hebrew. So last week, it's not obvious in the parable, it's really obvious in the Greek that justice and righteousness, they are the same word. They're the same root word, D-I-K, same root word. So we had the opponent, grant me justice, dikaios, against my adversary, anti-dikaiona. You're like, it's all over it. So it's like so repeated that this is a parable that has something to do with justice and righteousness, which we use 2 words, and the Greeks only used 1, but it was repeated over and over in that parable. And what'd she do? Was she praying last week? Nope. She was haranguing the judge. Grant me justice against my adversary. And the judge said, what? He said, I have no regard for God. I have no regard for human beings, yet I will give this woman justice so that she will not blacken my eye. That's what it says in the Greek. We gussy that up, and she won't embarrass me, or she won't wear me out. She won't blacken my eye, was the euphemism. This parable comes immediately afterwards. Right? And I talked about how Luke kind of gives a little introduction and gives a wrap up to the parable. And he does the same today, that this is a parable about those who trust in their own righteousness versus, the righteousness of God. And there's a thing about those who exalt themselves will be humble, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. I think that's actually Luke sort of giving an Aesop's fable. The moral of the story is ending. Luke does that because he's writing to a Gentile Greco-Roman audience, and he's writing the greatest adventure story ever told, the story of Jesus Christ. So stripping away the introduction and the kind of moralistic ending, let's look at this parable again. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. Sounds like 2 guys going to a bar story, doesn't it? Yeah. If it sounds familiar, that's a setup for a joke. But 2 men go up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. Now, we are pre-programmed, and we know the rest of this because we've heard this parable before. This isn't new, is it? For anybody? No, a lot of people. That might be new for a couple people, but it's a fairly familiar parable. But we hear it through the lens of 2,000 years of Christianity. All right, so we're filtering it through our Christian lens. I want to take us back to how the first hearers might have heard this instead. Do you have a positive image? If someone says the word Pharisee, do you have an immediate positive or negative reaction to that? Negative. Why? How is that word used in our language and parlance? If you call someone a Pharisee, what are you saying to them? Hypocrite. Right. That's 2,000 years of anti-Jewish dialogue. So my one lesson to you today is, if you want to call somebody a hypocrite, call them a hypocrite. It is anti-Semitic to call them a Pharisee. All right. Because back in Jesus's day, the Pharisees weren't bad guys, but we've kind of flat Stanley'd them into the foil and the bad guys that Jesus is always arguing with. Jesus is debating with the Pharisees, and in fact, his theology is the same as the Pharisees, right? He believes in the resurrection of the righteous. That makes him a Pharisee. That's Pharisaic theology. And in fact, Pharisaic theology is the red thread that brings us to modern Judaism today. Now, Judaism has evolved. There are different festivals and things that didn't exist in Jesus's time. Hint, Hanukkah's one of them. Jesus never celebrated Hanukkah, all right? But the idea that there's something beyond this life, that there will be a resurrection of the righteous, the messianic age, those are not fully fleshed out in Judaism, but they are concepts within Jewish theology. So it's Pharisaic Judaism that survived. And Jesus is preaching in that vein. So let's just drop the use of Pharisee as a pejorative. And if you want to call somebody a hypocrite, call them a hypocrite. That's more accurate. The first hearers of this parable would know that the Pharisees were righteous people. In fact, Jesus even said, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees, you will not get into the kingdom. So there are times that he commends the Pharisees, but he also debates them. And the back and forth is a debate. So the original hearers would have heard of Pharisee not as a negative, pejorative thing, but this is an upstanding citizen. This is someone who knows Torah, right? This guy's a good guy. Tax collectors, on the other hand. How many of you have watched The Sopranos back in the day? A few hands up. How about seen The Godfather? Goodfellas? Okay, that's the kind of guy the tax collector is. Because in Rome, what they would do to an occupied territory is they would recruit collaborators in the neighborhood to collect the taxes. And the rule was you sent this much to Rome, and anything you collected over that was yours to keep. You think that might have been a system that could be abused? Just a little bit? Yeah, tax collectors were not poor people. They often were quite wealthy. And they ratted out their fellow Galileans, Judeans, because they knew where you lived. You didn't pay your taxes, they would let Rome know. And you either got thrown in prison or sometimes you just got killed because, well, that was the price of doing business. Tax collectors were not the good guys. They were feared and they were deeply hated because they were seen as traitors who ratted out their fellow citizens, shouldn't even say citizens because most of these folks weren't citizens of Rome, but they ratted out their fellow townspeople and villagers to the Roman authorities, as well as stole their money. Not good guys. So the first hearers would have heard about an upstanding citizen and an extortionist go up to the temple to pray. So they were pre-programmed to hear this very differently. And so the Pharisee stands off and, like the judge last week, has a little internal dialogue. We hear his prayer where he goes over his CV. And let's check that CV out. I thank you that I'm not like other people, which, by the way, was not an unusual prayer. There's a number of prayers that have been documented that was like, I thank you that I'm an upstanding person and I'm not like, one of them was, I thank you I wasn't born a woman. Okay. Yeah, there's something to offend everybody, with those prayers. But these were early Jewish prayers. So we thank you. I'm not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. And then he reads off his CV, right? I fast twice a week. Once a week was the requirement of Torah. So he goes above and beyond the call of duty. And I give 1/10 of all my income. Torah required 1/10 of your livestock and your food. 1/10. Not all your income. So again, he goes above and beyond. Let's face it, we would have him given a ministry minute here during he would lead the annual giving campaign. probably get elected senior warden. This guy's an upstanding citizen. But the extortionist, the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." Now, up to this point, the original hearers would even be more irritated because the tax collector uses an imperative command. God be merciful to me, a sinner, was not a request. He's commanding God to be merciful to him. Who does this guy think he is? The audacity. God be merciful to me, a sinner. And the punchline comes next. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. There's the end of the parable. How do you feel about it now? It's a little more uncomfortable, isn't it? The guy who comes in after shaking down his fellow villagers for money and is probably going to go back home and do it all over again next week, who has the audacity to command God for mercy, he goes home justified. I don't like this parable. How about you? Oh, I'm with you, Zach. I don't like this parable. This parable's uncomfortable. The reason that we often make the parables comfortable is, we like to tame Jesus into somebody we can predict, somebody we can control or manipulate. And Jesus has always got a surprise up his sleeve. With this parable, it's who gets justified. And part of that is a parable about grace. This is a parable of grace. It's not a parable of judgment. It's not a parable of the kingdom. It is about pure grace, which is absolutely unmerited. It's not something we can earn. It's not something our impressive pledge card can buy, or something that our actions can gain for us. It is pure gift. And we're not programmed to receive pure gift, are we? Our thoughts are like, what's the catch? There's no free lunch, right? Grace is unmerited. It's undeserved. And even the people we don't like are going to get grace. Now, let's face it, this parable could be written for today. We could substitute characters in any time, couldn't we? Right? A pope and a pimp go up to St. Peter's to pray. We could rewrite it. A MAGA Christian nationalist and a progressive Christian go into a church to pray, and you could flip those either direction. Oof. It is a parable that convicts our hearts, because our honesty before God is, no matter what we do or don't do, what we are in need of mercy, and we are in need of grace, and there is such a thing waiting for us. Yes, grace isn't fair. We didn't earn it. And we live in a capitalistic society that tells us we have to earn every single thing. But that's not how God's love works. God's love is poured out. The question is whether we will receive it or not. And it isn't fair. And I still think this dude had a lot of audacity to command God to be merciful. Because frankly, I beg for mercy. And that's not patting myself on the back. It's just I don't want to have that audacity before God. But honest prayers and the ability to receive grace are probably one I think is a real challenge for us. Living in a society where merit and what you contribute to society is your determination of your value. Grace doesn't work that way. Grace breaks the rules, and grace will humble us if we truly attend to it. The free love of God is there for all of us, whether it's fair or not.